Alrighty, hello everybody, and welcome back to another week of presentations. I'm Alexandria Williams, a prevention specialist at the Willow Domestic Violence Center, and basically I get to just give presentations about foundational DV information as well as unhealthy versus healthy relationships, DV 101, things like that. If this is your first time joining us today, welcome. Thank you for tuning in. This is the Willow 101 series, which is on our YouTube. So I have been doing presentations for the past few months. So if you would like to catch up or you have a topic that you would like to learn more about, please go ahead and subscribe to the Willow on YouTube and feel free to watch those videos at your convenience. So today we're going to be talking about DV and disability barriers. So today we're going to be really focusing on our survivors who have disabilities, kind of what their lives might look like regarding wanting to receive services and things like that. So today is, like we do every week, just foundational information about this specific population today. If you have any questions for me during the presentation or afterwards, please feel free to email me at awilliams@willowdvcenter.org, Williams being WILLIAMS. And as always, I like to give a trigger warning before diving in today. If there might be some information that might be difficult to hear, difficult to process in the moment, so please feel free to do whatever you feel you need to do to take care of yourself during our presentation today. As I said, these presentations are recorded, so it will be up on the Willow's YouTube channel if you would like to watch it at a later time. So to begin, I have a quote. I like to start off with quotes. Studies show that people with disabilities are more likely to experience abuse than people without them. Abuse is based on power and control, and people with disabilities often face specific barriers to accessing help that make them more vulnerable to abuse. So I feel like this is a really good way to basically explain why we need to talk about this, why this matters, because we do have a lot of survivors who have disabilities, and unfortunately, it's not really a population that we tend to pay a lot of mind to and try to make our services more accessible to, which is what we should be doing. So today I'm hoping we can learn more about how to better support these survivors. So why it matters. So again, kind of like what the quote said, violence within this specific population is a lot higher. And it often tends to not really be recognized by society as an actual problem. Definitely not kind of one of the more popular populations that we tend to talk about when regarding DV, but one of the most important populations for sure. And it matters because there are many barriers to accessing services for people with disabilities, as well as it's important to be able to spot it if you are someone who spends time with the survivor who has disabilities, or if you're around. It's important to kind of know how to spot it, what you can do, how you can best support them through that time. So it's important to have this information, definitely. So some statistics. So in 2008, intimate partners perpetrated 27% of violent crime against women with disabilities and 1.1% of crime against men with disabilities. So what we're seeing here is there is kind of a vast difference between possibly women identifying survivors who have disabilities compared to male identifying survivors who have disabilities. Just because the percentage is lower for male survivors doesn't mean there's barely any male survivors who have disabilities. It could just mean that they haven't reported, which is usually the case for a lot of these statistics, is the lack of self-reporting does affect the data that we receive. So I always like to assume that since we know that people often tend to not report, that the number that we are provided, to go ahead and probably assume that it is higher than that. But these percentages already, that's a big chunk of survivors who have disabilities who are experiencing violent crimes. Next, we have people with disabilities experience violent crimes as twice the rate of people without disabilities, so kind of what we talked about in the last slide as well. And lastly, police are actually less likely to respond to reported violence against survivors with disabilities than those without disabilities. So these percentages I have right down here. So 90% of reports the police responded to, and that 90% are for people who don't have disabilities, but police only respond to about 77% of reports that are made by individuals who do have disabilities, especially survivors who have a disability. So that means that they are not even coming to see what's going on. They're not really even checking it out, and this often has to do with the fact that survivors already are not believed, but then survivors who have a disability are even less believed. So the fact that they're not, in some cases, not even coming out to check on the survivor to make sure that they're safe, things like that, simply because they're not believing them, is a real problem. So another piece of the statistic part of this presentation is I wanted to focus on this specific survey. It's called the Spectrum Institute Disability and Abuse Project survey. And they found, after doing the survey, that about 70% of respondents with disabilities experience some form of abuse by an intimate partner, family member, caregiver, acquaintance, or stranger. So I wanted to go through what types of abuse is most common that they found. So 87.2% experienced verbal emotional abuse, 50.6% experienced physical abuse, 41.6% experienced sexual abuse, 37.4% experienced neglect, 31.5% experienced financial abuse, and 37.3% reported the abuse to law enforcement. So out of all the respondents that took this survey, only 37% of them reported any of this abuse to police. So that goes back to what we were just talking about how survivors are very unlikely to report, but survivors with disabilities are even less likely. So 37% is definitely appalling. They found that abusers were only arrested in 10% of abuse cases that were reported to law enforcement. So we can see how this in itself is a barrier. As a survivor, it takes a lot to report and to go through with that. And it's a taxing time for survivors when they have to do that. So for them to do that, and then to know that only 10% of the abusers who were accused even got prosecuted, I mean, that is, for me, I would be wary of even going through the whole process of having to report and everything if only 10% were being prosecuted. So we have to be able to understand that from their perspective too, because I know a lot of the times we question why people don't just report. Why don't you call the police? Why don't you, all of these factors, but we kind of have to be patient and understanding and realize that that might not really be what they're wanting to do. That might not be the answer for them. And they might not even get really the results that they're wanting if they do go through with that. But also supporting them if they do want to go through with it, because they deserve to be safe. So it's important that looking at these statistics that we are recognizing how many people, how much basically this is impacting survivors with disabilities. I mean, they are facing very high rates of abuse within their homes. So keep that in mind. So next I want to talk about some more signs of abuse. So some red flags if you are a family member or friend and you have and you have an individual in your life who is a survivor with disabilities, these are some things to look out for that might indicate that there is abuse or domestic violence happening within the home. So if they're wearing torn, stained, soiled, or bloody clothing, if they're suddenly being unable to meet essential day-to-day living needs that affect their health, safety, or well-being, if there are signs of injuries to internal organs such as vomiting, if they have unexplained sprains, fractures, or dislocations, burns, cuts, or puncture wounds, visible handprints or bruising on the face, neck, arms, or wrists, and lack of contact with friends or family. So as we just heard, the majority of the abuse that is happening is emotional and verbal. So a lot of these things on this wheel right here, you're not going to be able to identify that way, except really for if you notice that they're not meeting their day-to-day needs, and if they're becoming more isolated, so maybe you haven't talked to them yet, or you usually talk to them every day, and now you're only talking to them once a week, something like that. Those are things to look out for, as well as if the abuser is refusing to let you visit with the survivor or stop by to see the survivor, things like that are all signs that something might be going on within the home. So as y'all know, I love my power and control wheels. So this one is specifically for survivors with disabilities. I'm not going to go through every piece of it because I don't want to take up too much of your time today, but I will talk about a couple of pieces of it. So let's go ahead and let's do the emotional abuse, since we were just talking about that. So if the abuser is insulting or shaming the survivor's disability, if they're giving conflicting messages by both helping and hurting, if they're purposely trying to sneak up and startle them, if the abuse increases as the survivor becomes more independent, if they start driving dangerously to scare the survivor, if they disrespect the survivor's boundaries, talks down to them, or torments them by not letting them sleep. These are all common examples of what emotional abuse would look like for a survivor who has a disability. So that gives you another kind of list of red flags to be able to pay attention for if the survivor is reporting that those things are happening to them. Let's do minimize, deny, and blame. So if the abuser lies about abuse to others, says partner is crazy, fell out of a wheelchair, or is forgetful, or they didn't take their medications, if the abuser is blaming the survivor's disability for the abuse, so basically saying, well, it's because you are blank or whatever, that is why I am abusing you, because of your disability, which is just not right. There's no excuse for abuse ever. If they twist reality, says abuse did not happen, so basically gaslighting the survivor, maybe saying that they're overreacting, or just blatantly saying something did not happen, and knowing that it would be hard for the survivor to prove that it did in most cases. All right, so I do recommend you take a good look at this. This is such a good resource. I love Power and Control Wheels. They are so educational, so please feel free to pause this if you're watching the recording and go ahead and read through those as well if you'd like to. So next I'm going to talk about some more specific tactics that abusers will be using to keep that power and control going. So let's go ahead and jump in. So telling you that you aren't allowed to have a pain flare-up, if they're stealing or withholding Social Security disability checks, so that would be economic abuse going on. If they're telling you that you're a bad parent or can't be a parent because of your disability, invalidating or minimizing a disability with claims that you're faking it, using a disability in an effort to shame or humiliate you, refusing to help you complete necessary life tasks, including using the bathroom or dispensing meds. And that is really and what they have found is often this type of abuse, not helping the survivor take their meds, use the bathroom, things like that, is occurring with caregivers, and the caregivers are commonly their own family members, which is, again, another barrier to them receiving services, and also being believed, all in all. Abusers might withhold or threaten to withhold meds, or might intentionally be giving the survivor incorrect doses by over-medicating or mixing meds in a dangerous way or non-prescribed way. Abusers partake in sexual activity. If an abuser partakes in sexual activity and your disability makes you incapable of giving consent, that is sexual assault, and it is also a tactic that is commonly used by abusers. Withholding, damaging, or destroying assistive devices, and if they're preventing you from seeing a doctor. They might try to harm or threaten to harm your service animal. As we know from previous presentations, abusers tend to use a survivor's pets or animals against the survivor. Oftentimes, they will inflict pain on the pet instead of the survivor, because that might be more emotionally traumatic for the survivor than if they were personally receiving the abuse themselves. If they're using your disability to justify their behavior, and threatening to out your disability to others if it's non-visible or carries social stigma. So these are the most common tactics that are used. So if I just read through those, and you're watching this currently right now and you're picking up on some of those things I just talked about, it might be happening in your own relationship or in someone you know's relationship. Those are all extremely unhealthy. And the person who is doing these specific acts to you or your friend, they are doing it to gain power and control over them, not because they love them, not because they care about them or are wanting to support them, but they're doing it for their own personal gain, and it's abusive. So please make sure you're looking out for those behaviors as well. So now I want to kind of talk more about some unique barriers that survivors who have a disability face. So escaping an abuser often means leaving the home or care facility for them, and sometimes they have no alternative for care, and no alternative for another place to live. So they might be weighing those options of, well, yes, I'm being mistreated, yes, I'm being abused, but at least I'm being fed, at least I have shelter, at least I'm getting my meds, things like that, compared to the possibility of them being homeless. So that is one of the larger barriers, and that is something that also survivors without a disability face too, but it's even more difficult for those with a disability when they're relying on someone to care for them, especially. DV agencies are often not equipped or trained to offer proper care to survivors with disabilities. There's also a lot of struggles with making things accessible for people who have disabilities. Personally, the Willow works really hard to make all their services inclusive and accessible, but just like any other agency, all agencies, we can all do better at supporting our survivors with disabilities, of course. So that is often the barrier, often that fear that they won't have things in place that will make the services accessible either. Again, often not believe when they do decide to report abuse. Abusers do tend to perceive survivors with disabilities as pretty easy targets, because of the societal stereotypes, of course, and again, going back to that 10% number that we talked about in the beginning about how few abusers get prosecuted when they abuse a survivor with a disability. So that is a huge barrier for them, especially when it comes to reporting. And many people with disabilities, especially people who have an intellectual or a cognitive disability, are taught and expected to follow the directions of those in charge and comply with someone else's wants, needs, or demands. So that also makes them a viable target for abusers who know that that is how they have to function on a day-to-day basis. So all of these make it extremely difficult for those to receive services. And so it's important that we have this education on what we can do, what it looks like, how to identify it, what those barriers are, and making sure that those who are working within the DV realm are doing all that we can to make our services as accessible as possible, so the survivor feels supported at all times when they are working with us. So what can you do? Believe the survivor. That's always the biggest thing that we encourage, is that it takes a lot for a survivor to come to you and talk to you about the abuse. There's a lot of guilt, a lot of shame that's usually accompanied with the abuse that they're experiencing. So if a survivor comes to you and they tell you, even if you feel like, well, even if you know the abuser and you feel like there's no way that they could be doing that, trusting and believing the survivor and believing that they wouldn't tell you that something was going on if nothing was going on, which is how it is in most cases. So simply believing them, saying, I believe you, what can I do to support you, is very helpful. Again, paying attention to those red flags and those warning signs, always keeping your eye out, always checking in with the survivor, making sure if you know there's violence going on in the home, making sure that the survivor and you stay in contact, and even that goes kind of into safety planning. Maybe having a code word that they can text you, or maybe having a specific time a week that you stop by to make sure they're okay. Whatever they agree to, being willing to do that for them and support them through that. And lastly, reporting the abuse to adult protective services. So if you're noticing any of the red flags, any of the warning signs that we talked about today, and the survivor who has a disability is unable to make the report themselves, we do encourage, and the national hotline, the National Domestic Violence Hotline also encourages that you go ahead and put in a report to adult protective services. So that is all I have for you all today. Thank you so much for tuning in with me and taking time to learn more about this population and what you can do to support them. Again, if you have any questions after I conclude this presentation, please feel free to email me, and I hope to see you next time. Thank you.